Hazel Barkworth. Welcome to the Great Big Book Club. And you are the author of the new novel Heatstroke by Headline,
Yes.
published by Headline. And it's a sort of coming of age story and a growing old story and a sad rock and roll mom and a mother and daughter and the best friend goes missing. Could you give us a brief reading from your fantastic book, and then we'll have a bit of a chat about it.
Fantastic. I'm going to read from the very first chapter. So this is the opening of Heatstroke. Languid. The word that formed in Rachel's mind was languid. The figure on the lawn was languid. Its limbs were loose, its joints fluid, its hands and feet seemed too heavy for the bones that held them. It was draped over the sun lounger, dripping from its edges. Not a single muscle seemed tense. Rachel knew she was staring. The sun was so high that everything in the garden was bleached. The grass was brittle and the patio slabs blinding white. Rachel's feet were cool against the kitchen tiles and it felt indulgent. It had been too hot for days, but was only mid-June. There were still 5 weeks until the school holidays began. The temperature had crept into the high 20s every afternoon, and Rachel had woken tangled in the sheets every morning. She stood at the sink, squeaking a dishcloth into mugs. One by one, she rubbed the stains from their nooks, then placed them on the draining rack. The outside brightness made the inside gloomy. She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving the torpid figure. Even this close to the window, Rachel was still in the shade. There was no way she could be visible from the garden. A towel made the lounger soft. Rachel had owned that beach towel for 18 years. She remembered buying it in a Cornish surf shack she'd felt too hip for. It bore a now faded dreamscape, a technicolor sunset with Aloha Hawaii scrawled in pink. The towel was 3 years older than the body that lay on it. There she was, in her lime green bikini, her head tilted so her meter of hair waterfalled over the side of the lounger. Her drink was only an arm's length away, but she moved so slowly it seemed to take enormous effort. Just reaching down to the grass was apparently enough to exhaust her. As Mia settled back, the left strap of her bikini top fell from her shoulder. There was a shock of white where the material had been. The rest of her was slick with lotion, but turning a warm pink that would blossom to brown. She was baking her body perfectly. She stretched to her full length, the wingspan that seemed impossible, the bubblegum painted toenails. Her eyes would be closed behind those plastic sunglasses. She arched her back, forcing her breasts upwards, pouting, as if she was being photographed. Rachel stepped further back into the dusk of the kitchen. The window would form a mirror in the sunlight. Mia slouched back again. Supine on that towel, nothing could be troubling her. There were no hairs on her legs, not even little golden ones that might glint on her thighs. Not a single bristle would snag any palm that stroked them. Rachel found her eyes lingering on the shadow where those green bikini bottoms met the skin. It was just as smooth there. Rachel wondered what blade or wax or lotion had removed the hair. Had Mia holed herself up in the bathroom and waited while noxious cream burned every follicle away? Had she held the skin taut and dragged a razor against the grain? Had she booked an appointment to have it ripped out of her? Rachel wanted to know who it was designed to impress. Who else did Mia expect to see that patch of flesh? Rachel longed to hold that body she'd known so well. The clavicle she'd kissed so often, the ribs she'd once xylophoned. Mia lifted an arm to swat something from her thigh, some insect or pollen spore, some floating dandelion seed that had dared to tickle her. Rachel worried it was instead her own gaze made solid. She worried her daughter knew she was watching.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you so much. Quite an odd observation of a mother to her daughter, wouldn't you think? It was brilliant. It's almost like they are lovers.
I wanted to sort of take that very famous Lolita image and subvert it and not have a male gaze looking at a young woman, but actually a female gaze and a loving female gaze, but one that can also still see her in all the glory of her.
It's amazing. It's amazing. So tell me a bit about the actual plot of Heatstroke.
So it's the story of three women, a sort of one woman and two girls who think they're women. So Rachel, the protagonist, who's a school teacher, her 15-year-old daughter, Mia, who we saw sunbathing, and Mia's best friend, Lily. And it's essentially the impact on all three of them when Lily doesn't come home one day. And Rachel especially becomes increasingly obsessed with where she is, who she's with, and why she went away.
And how did you come up with the idea, and how did you develop it? What was the process behind it all?
It was very much the image that I just read, actually. That was the first thing I ever wrote, and it's barely changed since I sort of scribbled it into an email format several years ago. I knew I wanted to play with the idea of mothers and daughters and relationships between women, especially when they get a bit darker. I wanted to sort of show some of the more unpleasant sides of female relationships, the jealousies and the sort of obsessions and things like that. And then I went on the Curtis Brown writing course. I had about 3,000 words and a roughly typed out synopsis of what would happen, and actually developed it a great deal whilst on that course.
How amazing. So how long did it take you to actually write the whole thing?
The whole thing, probably about 18 months beginning to end, sort of alongside a full-time job, scribbling in coffee shops and writing at weekends and things like that.
And how did you get onto the Curtis Brown course? Because it sounds amazing.
It was fantastic. It was run by Erin Kelly, who's always been quite a big influence on me. So I was anything to get to be taught by her. And you had to submit 3,000 words, and I had 3,000 words. And I thought, well, that's fate. And then scribbled a synopsis, which was just literally what was in my head at the time. And then I think they select from those which they like. But it was nice to start it with almost nothing and then get to plan what the book might become from there.
And had you ever entered any writing competitions before?
Yeah, I'd written a couple of books that live in a drawer and will stay there forever, that I think I see as almost my apprenticeship, like all the words you have to write to work out what it is you want to write and how you want to write that. So I'd sort of got long listed for a few bits and pieces here, but until I hit upon this story, hadn't really found the thing that crystallized everything.
And had you always wanted to be a writer? Was that what you'd sort of practiced writing in your passport as a child? Had you always thought, I will be a writer?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so nosy, and it's just a really great way to essentially gossip about people, but not real people, so you can get away with it. To me, it's just that instinct to find all the juiciest bits in life and want to sort of dig into them, and it lets you do that in a really sort of pleasant way that doesn't upset anybody.
And did you, what were your influences as a young fledgling writer?
I was the sort of teenager, I never read all those classic novels that other people have read. I've no idea what The Secret Garden is. It's presumably a secret. I devoured Judy Blume. I devoured Sweet Valley High and all of those, what you think look like trashy books, until you look at them and think, actually, they're about the relationships between teenage girls and the things that bother women and the things that actually happen in real lives. And I always felt quite guilty as a teenager for absolutely ploughing through The Babysitter's Club and Sweet Valley High and those sorts of really terrible series. But in hindsight, that's what I'm interested in. That's what I still read in adult fiction, and the things that I'm drawn to now are about the real lives of women.
And it must be very difficult being published as a debut during the COVID crisis. You know, it's very sad that, you know, people, and you've got a beautiful cover to your book, the idea that no one can actually caress it and smell it in the shop and everything. Do you think what was your publishing experience been like so far? Has it been okay? I mean, were you excited when the book came up, a physical copy? I mean,
absolutely.
First couple of days.
I think the beauty of being a debut is I don't know any different. This is the experience I've had, and it's been incredible. And it was awful in those few weeks when every event that was in the diary one by one got cancelled, and you understand why, but it was exciting to have those in the diary. But what's been really amazing, actually, is how all these virtual events have popped up, and you always assume it's going to feel a bit cold and distant, and that hasn't been my experience at all. It's felt so warm and so welcoming, and the support of people like book bloggers and booksellers who can't even be in their bookshops at the moment, but are still supportive. To me, it's just been a really amazing experience so far. Not what I imagined, but something very different and very sort of precious in its own right.
And have you got another deal? Is there another one coming, or are you?
I'm certainly scribbling ideas for the next one. I'm ploughing through that at the moment, and similar sorts of themes, I think. The idea of the relationships between women, especially when they're slightly toxic, when it shows that side that I don't think we're meant to show as women. I think female characters either seem very, very good or wretched. And that in-between space, that just very ordinary sort of awfulness of envy and vanity and jealousy and all those things, which I think is very true to the experience of being a person. But I really like exploring how those things come to light.
Well, congratulations on Heatstroke, Hazel, Barkworth.
Thank you so much.
You've done brilliantly, and it's got incredible reviews. I've got a sultry, stifling debut. It's out now, and it's published by Headline. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Hello, Abbie Greaves. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Excellent. Well, you are the author of The Silent Treatment, which has been published by Century, and it has had incredible reviews. It's about a couple who've been married for 40 years who don't talk to each other for 6 months. Is that correct?
That is indeed, yes.
Brilliant. Aaron, I wondered if you could do a little reading for us, just to give us a flavour of your fantastic novel.
Absolutely. So I've decided on a reading that's very close to the beginning, and it's in the voice of Frank. The first time I saw you, all I could make out were your eyes and the very tip of your nose, ruby red like a beacon in the cold. You had a thick woolly scarf pulled up over your lips, your hair bunched up under it so that only a few wisps could escape. When you arrived, it was as it ever would be, like a cyclone descending, all flailing limbs and air kisses, a flurry of hugs and exclamation, and the sort of warmth everyone in the vicinity could feel, even at 3 degrees below. I hadn't seen you around before, that much I knew for sure. I'd been in Oxford for 5 years by that point, and I was knee-deep into my DPhil. The lab was hardly swarming with women, and it wasn't as if I was dripping in them in my spare time either. No, I definitely would have remembered if I'd seen a girl like you before. With its cheap lager and large outdoor seating area, the Rose and Crown was a stomping ground for the developmental biology department. If such a thing could be claimed by a group of scientists who didn't see much daylight, let alone the social evening hours. It was far enough from the dreaming spires to dodge the cannon-wielding tourists, but close enough to stumble back to halls if anyone did manage to land it lucky at the end of the night. I know it's a cliche to say I noticed you straight away, but it would still be true, even if your elbow hadn't half caught Piotr's glass as you barreled past and into the arms of your equally excitable friends. I was looking forward to that evening, a Christmas party of sorts, only the budget didn't stretch far enough for any sort of planning to have been required. Instead, the 2 supervisors had come and put a fistful of notes in the glass for us to buy rounds. I wonder what would have happened without the departmental Dutch courage, if I could have focused on the merriment in hand instead of mooning at your table, reading into your mad hand gestures and facial expressions as if I were at a mime performance, not in a pub garden. You are, naturally, the centre of attention, a habit I will come to realise, holding court and magnetising all eyes to you. To your left, a man with sandy hair and a tweed jacket hangs on your every word, laughing a little too loudly and a beat or so before the rest do. There is some distance between you, though, and I write him off as another acolyte, enthralled to your charms. It doesn't take long for the boys to cotton on that my mind and attentions are elsewhere, Piotr nudging me in the ribs and delivering the sort of crude remarks that make me thankful the last 4 years of his doctorate haven't entirely thinned out his Polish accent. It's Jack, our lab technician, a man who dedicates 40 hours a week to breeding newts, who makes the only sensible remark of the night. "What have you got to lose, Frank?" he says. "Another night in a cold single bed?"
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you. So yours is about, tell me a bit about the plot. And it's interesting because you've got 2 different voices in it as well, isn't it? You do a male voice and a female voice, Frank and Maggie. So tell me a bit about the plot and why you decided to write it like that.
Yes, so when the novel opens, we're at the end of the 6 months where Frank and Maggie, this couple who've been married for 40 years, haven't spoken. And it's been tense and it's been incredibly difficult. And when we open the novel, things have come to a head and Maggie has collapsed at the kitchen table. And when Frank finds her, he rushes her to hospital. And the first thing that the nurses there say is that he needs to start speaking to her because that's the only way that they're going to have any hope of getting through. And as he does so, he reels back through their 40 years together with all its highs and all its lows. And eventually he unravels the secrets that have silenced him. So it's a love story and it has a mystery at its heart. And I suppose part of the reason why I wanted to show both voices, apart from to show the ways in which the silence had a strain on both of them and the way in which it was a kind of shared experience, was also because something that comes out in this story is that just like every tale has two sides, every marriage also does. And one person's view of the relationship can be completely different to the other. And more likely than not, it's not even two sides, it's more like a prism. There's so many different perspectives that can be seen there. So that's why I did the two voices.
How difficult was it to do the male and the female voice? Did you very seriously think about the different vocabulary they would use, or tell me a bit about that process?
Yeah, so the novel opens with Frank's voice, and I actually strangely found that a lot easier than Maggie's voice. And perhaps it was because it was his character who came to me first. He's also pretty likable. He makes a lot of mistakes, but he's very upfront about that. Whereas Maggie, she has a lot of me in her. She's quite prickly and a little thorny. And it was, how do you control that in a way that shows all those different sides of her without dulling her out? So I suppose there was a lot about word choice. There was also a lot, strangely, just about rhythm, the way they speak in different rhythms like we all do. So yeah, there were definitely challenges to that, and that was something that I really worked on throughout the kind of numerous edits, just making sure that the voices sounded assured and distinct as well.
Did you find yourself sitting differently at the desk when you were writing for each character? Because I've written as a bloke before, and I found myself sitting as a bloke, trying to channel the bloke.
You know, maybe that's what I should have done, and it would have flowed slightly easier. The only way I sat different is probably I hunched increasingly as the sort of months went on. No, I didn't. I had a playlist, which is probably available still on Spotify somewhere, with some songs that definitely skewed towards Frank and some that skewed towards Maggie. Perhaps it helps as well that the first section is from Frank's point of view and the second is from Maggie's. So it's not a kind of alternating structure, and that allowed me a long period to kind of get into each head.
And how did you get the idea to write about a 6-month silence?
Yes, so it was actually inspired initially by a tiny sort of sub-article in Metro, the underground newspaper, which was about a couple in Japan who hadn't spoken for 20 years. I know, it was fairly sensational, and I think that was obviously the angle that Metro had taken. It was picked up in a few other places. But I just couldn't stop thinking about the idea of a silence in a relationship, particularly a relationship of some length. How would that settle? And, why? And I think when you start asking yourself questions like that, and it's really kind of all-consuming, as a novelist, that's what you need to kind of get anything off the ground. So that was the initial spark of inspiration. I'm very grateful I am too that I read that.
Brilliant. And so how difficult, because you were a publisher's assistant, is that right?
I was.
Was it a slam dunk getting published, or?
No, it certainly doesn't feel like it. In terms of writing, like Hazel was saying earlier, it's about finding pockets of time before work, after work, at the weekend, days of holiday, wherever you can find it. And then in terms of finding an agent and then finding a publisher, I knew I kind of wanted to keep it very separate from my work in a literary agency at the time. So I submitted the silent treatment under a pseudonym. So, and that was, its own adventure. But no, I'm glad I did that, because I think for me it was a good opportunity to see whether the piece had legs in and of itself. So yeah, not a slam dunk, but though it's definitely beneficial to know a bit about publishing before you go into this whole new world.
And did you always want to be a writer? Was that always your thing? I mean, do you read English at Oxford, is that right?
Yeah, I read English at Cambridge, so it's always been books. It was definitely always reading, which I think is probably common for lots and lots of authors, that, you read so much that eventually you think, oh, maybe I have a story that I really want to tell as well. So Yeah, and then I suppose when I was working in the literary agency, you see a different side, because suddenly you don't just see the finished beautiful hardback, you see a first draft, and then you're able to compare, you know, the two different forms, and they're not the same, obviously. So perhaps that gave me a sense that being a writer was a kind of an achievable, if incredibly difficult, path. So that was probably the impetus, really.
And you like Hazel and everyone else on the site at the moment have been obviously published during COVID. I mean, what's that been like? Has it been okay? I mean, obviously you haven't been published before, so did you have a glass of champagne? Tell me.
I did. I had more than one, plenty. And it was very nice. I've got to say that friends and family and the publishing team do kind of rally round to try and create whatever sense of kind of IRL community might be lost. So yeah, on the day it was really special, and it's been great to do virtual events like this and to know that they have a potential reach of more than just 20 people in a bookshop. And that's something we can hope to kind of continue even when the world does open up again. So yeah, it's my first experience of publishing. I very much hope my second will be slightly different.
Are you doing another book? Are you doing another book at the moment?
Yes, and it's scheduled to come out next year, but like all things at the moment, that's incredibly up in the air. So we'll see. But for now, you know, writing is a great way to lose yourself in a world that often kind of looks slightly better than your own. So I'm just going to try and enjoy that for now.
Well, listen, Abbie Greaves, congratulations on the silent treatment. It's BBC Two Radio Book Club pick and a brilliantly reviewed, tremendously moving debut, and it's out now published by Century.
Thank you.
Emily Henry, hello, all the way from the USA.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, so you're the author of Beach Read, which is, very good cover, which is published by Viking over here in the UK. And it's a story about two writers with writer's block on neighbouring beach houses for the summer. And it's flying. So could you read us a little bit from the book, and then we'll have a chat?
Sure. I think I'll just take a page out of Hazel's book and start with the first chapter, the opening. The house. I have a fatal flaw. I like to think we all do, or at least it makes it easier for me when I'm writing, building my heroines and heroes up around this one self-sabotaging trait, hinging everything that happens to them on a specific characteristic, the thing they learn to do to protect themselves and can't let go of, even when it stops serving them. Maybe, for example, you didn't have much control over your life as a kid. So, to avoid disappointment, you learned never to ask yourself what you truly wanted. And it worked for a long time. Only now, upon realizing you didn't get what you didn't know you wanted, you're barreling down the highway in a midlife crisis mobile with a suitcase full of cash and a man named Stan in your trunk. Maybe your fatal flaw is that you don't use turn signals. Or maybe, like me, you're a hopeless romantic. You just can't stop telling yourself the story. The one about your own life, complete with melodramatic soundtrack and golden light lancing through car windows. It started for me when I was 12. My parents sat me down to tell me the news. Mom had gotten her first diagnosis, suspicious cells in her left breast, and she told me not to worry so many times I suspected I'd be grounded if she caught me at it. My mom was a doer, a laugher, an optimist, not a worrier. But I could tell she was terrified, and so I was too, frozen on the couch, unsure how to say anything without making things worse. But then, my bookish homebody of a father did something unexpected. He stood and grabbed our hands, one of Mom's, one of mine, and said, "You know what we need to get these bad feelings out? We need to dance." Our suburb had no clubs, just a mediocre steakhouse with a Friday night cover band, but Mom lit up like he'd just suggested taking a private jet to the Copacabana. She wore her buttery yellow dress and some hammered metal earrings that twinkled when she moved. Dad ordered 20-year-old scotch for them and a Shirley Temple for me, and the three of us twirled and bobbed until we were dizzy, laughing, tripping all over. We laughed until we could barely stand, and my famously reserved father sang along to Brown Eyed Girl like the whole room wasn't watching us. And then, exhausted, we piled into the car and drove home through the quiet. Mom and Dad holding tight to each other's hands between the seats. And I tipped my head against the car window, and watching the streetlights flicker across the glass, I thought, it's going to be okay. We will always be okay. And that was the moment I realized, when the world felt dark and scary, love could whisk you off. Beauty could punch holes in your fear. I decided then that my life would be full of both, not just for my own benefit, but for Mom's and for everyone else around me. There would be purpose, there would be beauty. There would be candlelight and Fleetwood Mac playing softly in the background. The point is, I started telling myself a beautiful story about my life, about fate and the way things work out, and by 28 years old, my story was perfect. Perfect, cancer-free parents who called several times a week, tipsy on wine or each other's company. Perfect, spontaneous, multilingual, 6'3" boyfriend who worked in the ER and knew how to make a perfect coke oven. Perfect shabby chic apartment in Queens, perfect job writing romantic novels inspired by perfect parents and perfect boyfriend for Sandy Lowe books, perfect life. But it was just a story, and when one gaping plot hole appeared, the whole thing unraveled. That's how stories work. Now, at 29, I was miserable, broke, semi-homeless, very single, and pulling up to a gorgeous lake house whose very existence nauseated me. Grandly romanticizing my life had stopped serving me, but my fatal flaw was still riding shotgun in my dinged-up Kia Soul, narrating things as they happened. January Andrews stared out the car window at the angry lake beating up on the dusky shore. She tried to convince herself that coming here hadn't been a mistake. It was definitely a mistake, but I had no better option. You didn't turn down free lodging when you were broke. I parked on the street and stared up the oversized cottage's facade, its gleaming windows and fairy tale of a porch, the shaggy beach grass dancing in the warm breeze. I checked the address of my GPS against the handwritten one hanging from the house key. This was it, all right. For a minute, I stalled, like maybe a world-ending asteroid would take me out before I was forced to go inside. Then I took a deep breath, got out, wrestled my overstuffed suitcase from the back seat along with the cardboard box full of gin handles. I pushed a fistful of dark hair out of my eyes to study the cornflower blue shingles and snow white trim. Just pretend you're at an Airbnb. Immediately, an imaginary Airbnb listing ran through my head. 3-bedroom, 3-bath, lakeside cottage, brimming with charm, and proof your father was an asshole and your life has been a lie. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you. It's a really interesting story about sort of writers with writer's block, and it's the story of literary fiction versus romantic fiction. Just tell me a bit about how you started it and how you came about the idea and everything.
Yeah, so I honestly...
The plot.
Yeah, the plot, as it were. Honestly, I was suffering from a bad case of writer's block myself. I had previously published in the US a couple of teen novels, young adult novels. And as I turned in my second book, I was so exhausted, but I also had all of this momentum. So I wanted to keep working, but I had no ideas. I had written 2 books in the last 2 years, so I was just really wiped out. But the seasons were changing, and I found that every time the weather shifts and the plant life shifts and the animals shift, I feel really inspired around those times of year. So I really wanted to be working, and I specifically wanted to be immersing myself in like a beachy, romantic, kind of light, fluffy story. So that was really all I had, and I was just desperate to work on something, and I couldn't come up with anything. I mean, I was lying on my floor just groaning at the ceiling, which is sort of my MO when I'm not writing. And finally, I just kind of decided, like, well, what if I just write about writer's block? I'll give a character writer's block, and I'll see where her story goes, and maybe that will be how I break through my own. And it very much was the case. I kind of just decided that, started that day without outlining or anything. And the book came so naturally, like it was the easiest thing I've ever worked on by far. I hammered out a very, very, very rough draft in about 3 weeks, and then I spent a long time rewriting it after that. But yeah, I mean, basically it was just all about seeing like what would challenge this woman, what would make it hard for her to push forward. So every plot decision I made was just about throwing up a new obstacle to her writing process and seeing how she dealt with it. And it was a very meta experience, and that's why it's a fairly meta book, but it was great. It was a blast to write.
And it's the story of 2 writers next door to each other, both with writer's block. And one is a cynical male, Augustus, is that, yes? And January is the female lead, as it were. So it's quite an interesting argument that between male writing and female writing.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the genre that's often called women's fiction, as well as in romance and in young adult, there's a lot of condescension to those genres, and there's a lot of assumptions made about those books and the people who write them. And I'm definitely someone who reads widely. I read literary fiction, I read romance, I read young adult novels, I read everything, and I don't really care, what genre it is if it can hold my attention. But you do come up against some of that condescension and some of that just snobbery in publishing. You meet people who don't take what you do very seriously, or they assume that you don't take it very seriously. And another one of the starting points really for this book was a conversation I'd had years before when I sold my first YA novel. We went out to dinner for a birthday dinner, and a friend of a friend was sitting next to me, and he asked how I was doing, and I told him, oh, I sold my first novel, and he asked what it was about, and I kind of described it. And he said to me, well, whatever makes you money, or something like that. It was like nobody can fault you for wanting to pay your bills. And it was really funny because obviously there's this notion out there among people who do not publish that publishing will make you rich. Very much not the case. But also just this assumption that this thing that I had sold, that I had labored over and had so much love for, was just something that I had kind of cranked out to try and make money, that it was a cash grab. And I found that really interesting. He thought that I would think my own book was beneath me, which was very much not the case. And yeah, you meet people who think you are beneath you because they don't really respect your genre, and you meet people who assume that you also are kind of in on the joke. And I really wanted to just play with those assumptions, and also show that, a book being categorized as women's fiction or romance really has nothing to say of the quality of writing or the depth of the characters or anything like that. But it's also not like a diatribe against literary fiction, which I love. It's very much about the interplay between the two and the way that those genres overlap, and the pride and prejudice of it all. The assumptions that we make about other people, but also that we assume people are making about us.
And how difficult was it to get published, having been a YA author, to shift from one genre to another?
Yeah, I think honestly, it's kind of funny, but I think it was easier for me because I was not a very successful YA author. I was thoroughly mid-list, which means I have a small pocket of devoted readers, but I'm not a bestseller by any means. So there wasn't really anyone who was part of my team who was trying to talk me out of this. They weren't like, this is going to lose you so many readers, and this is such a big mistake. It was really kind of like my second shot in a way. Not to say I'll never do YA again, but there wasn't really something to keep me firmly planted in that genre. And also I like reading and writing everything. So unfortunately, that means I'm going to have a career where a lot of times my readers are not necessarily going to love the next book after loving the one I put out before that. But yeah, I mean, I think it helped in a way because I already had an agent and had some connections and some momentum. But this is the first book that I've had released in the UK. So that's very exciting to me. It's sort of like, for American writers, that's sort of like one of the little dreams that you have and that you think of as like, you've made it if you can put out a book in the UK. Just because it's a very choosy market. I think it's a high threshold for what actually makes it into the cut.
Well, that's very exciting. And are you doing another one now? Or?
I am, and at this point, I don't believe Viking has bought rights to that, but fingers crossed. I'm definitely putting out another love story that's sort of women's fiction, commercial meets literary, around next summer, depending on what happens in the world between now and then.
Well, yes, there is that, isn't there? But thank you so much for joining us, Emily. I mean, you have been amazing, and it is called Beach Read, and it has been described as the hottest book of the summer. So well done you, and it's by Viking. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.